General George Washington was sworn in as the first President of the United States on April 30, 1789. President Washington entered office with the full support of the national and state leadership, and established the executive and judicial branches of the federal government of the United States. His leadership guaranteed the survival of the United States as a powerful and independent nation, and set the standard for future presidents. The Electoral College electors, which were chosen by the state legislatures, elected Washington unanimously in 1789 and again in the 1792 election. John Adams was elected vice president. Washington took the oath of office as the first president under the Constitution of the United States of America in 1789 at Federal Hall in New York City. Washington reluctantly accepted the position, and he never enjoyed being president. Washington proved an able administrator, an excellent delegator and judge of talent and character. He held regular cabinet meetings to debate issues before making a final decision. In handling routine tasks, he was systematic, orderly, energetic, solicitous of the opinion of others but decisive, intent upon general goals and the consistency of particular actions with them. Washington reluctantly served a second term as president. He served until March 4, 1797. He refused to run for a third, establishing the customary policy of a maximum of 2 terms for a president, which later became law by the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution. Washington, the only president yet unaffiliated with any political party, is generally considered by scholars and political historians as one of the greatest presidents in American history, usually ranking in the top 3 with Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Inauguration. Washington was inaugurated as the first President of the United States on April 30, 1789, near New York City's Wall Street, at Federal Hall. He insisted on having Barbados rum served. Taking office. Upon taking office, Washington initially focused on the establishment of the federal judiciary and executive departments. Establishment of judiciary. When Washington assumed office, the government of the United States had not yet been developed. Aside from the constitutionally established offices, no other agencies existed and no courts had yet been established. Instead of focusing on the executive branch, Washington's first acts were to establish the judiciary. Through the Judiciary Act of 1789, Washington established a 6-member Supreme Court. The court was composed of 1 Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices. The Supreme Court was given exclusive original jurisdiction over all civil actions between states, or between a state and the United States, as well as over all suits and proceedings brought against ambassadors and other diplomatic personnel, and original, but not exclusive, jurisdiction over all other cases in which a state was a party and any cases brought by an ambassador. The court was given appellate jurisdiction over decisions of the federal circuit courts as well as decisions by state courts holding invalid any statute or treaty of the United States, or holding valid any state law or practice that was challenged as being inconsistent with the federal Constitution, treaties, or laws, or rejecting any claim made by a party under a provision of the federal Constitution, treaties, or laws. Under the Supreme Court, the Judiciary Act created 13 judicial districts within the 11 states that had then ratified the Constitution. Within these judicial districts were circuit courts and district courts. The circuit courts, which were composed of a district judge and 2 Supreme Court justices, riding circuit, had jurisdiction over more serious crimes and civil cases, and appellate jurisdiction over the district courts, while the single-judge district courts had jurisdiction primarily over admiralty cases, along with petty crimes and lawsuits involving smaller claims. The circuit courts were grouped into 3 geographic circuits to which justices were assigned on a rotating basis. Creation of cabinet. Washington surrounded himself with a sophisticated team of consultants, supporters and successfully delegated most of the responsibility for the conduct of their officers to those trusted colleagues, of whom Alexander Hamilton was most powerful. The cabinet soon polarized between Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Washington's restraint regarding the Supreme Court and slavery, he favored some form of gradual emancipation, and his absence from public support for some of Hamilton's financial plans allowed him to develop both a nation and an office that appeared above the day-to-day political battles. The first executive offices created under the President were the Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of War, the Postmaster General, and the Attorney General. Each office, excluding the Attorney General, would head an executive department. These 5 officials, along with the President and Vice President, formed the backbone of the United States Cabinet. On July 27, 1789, Washington signed a bill into law reauthorizing an executive department of foreign affairs headed by a Secretary of Foreign Affairs, originally established by the Continental Congress in 1781. Congress passed another law renaming the Department of Foreign Affairs to United States Department of State and named the Secretary of State as head of the department. Washington approved this act on September 15, 1789. The Secretary's main function was to serve as the principal advisor to the President in the determination of foreign policy. Washington appointed Thomas Jefferson as the first state secretary on September 26, 1789. Dating back to 1775, on September 2, 1789, Washington re-established the United States Department of the Treasury headed by the Secretary of the Treasury. The Secretary served as the principal economic advisor to the President and would play a critical role in policy making by bringing an economic and government financial policy perspective to issues facing the government. The post would become the chief financial officer of the government. Alexander Hamilton was appointed by Washington to serve as the first Treasury Secretary on September 11, 1789. To manage the United States Army, Washington created the position of Secretary of War to head the United States Department of War. This office was a continuation of the Continental Secretary of War. The Secretary's duties were the formulation of Indian policy, planning for and managing the national military, and oversaw the creation of a series of coastal fortifications. Henry Knox served as the Continental War Secretary before the ratification of the United States Constitution, and Washington appointed Knox to continue under him as the first Secretary of War on September 12, 1789. When Washington signed the Judiciary Act of 1789, he not only created the federal judiciary but also created the office of Attorney General. Unlike the other cabinet officials, the Attorney General would not head an executive department until 1870. The Attorney General's functions would be to prosecute on behalf of the United States and to serve as the chief legal officer of the government by giving his advice and opinion upon questions of law to the President. Washington would appoint his former aide-de-camp Edmund Randolph as the first Attorney General on September 26, 1789. Along with the Attorney General, the United States Marshal's Service as well as the United States Attorneys were established. The final cabinet-level position created by Washington was the Postmaster General. The postmaster role went back to 1776, with the function to provide postal service for the United States. Later, to assist the postmaster, Washington signed the Postal Service Act on February 20, 1792, creating the United States Post Office Department. Washington appointed Samuel Osgood to the post on September 26, 1789 as the first Postmaster General. Executive mansions in the District of Columbia. Washington occupied 2 executive mansions during the 16 months he lived and worked in New York City: 3 Cherry Street and 39 to 41 Broadway. He played a leading role in the decision to locate the permanent national capital in the District of Columbia. In accordance with the Residence Act of 1790, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania served as temporary national capital for 10 years while the federal city was under construction. Beginning in November 1790, Washington and John Adams spent the lion's share of their presidencies in Philadelphia, but resisted efforts to make the city the permanent national capital. In an emergency, the federal government convened in Germantown, Pennsylvania in November 1793, when a yellow fever epidemic swept the city. Pennsylvania's Gradual Abolition Act made the state inhospitable to slaveholders, and Washington circumvented the state law by rotating the 9 Mount Vernon slaves in his presidential household in and out of Pennsylvania. The Residence Act of 1790 authorized the president to select the specific location of the permanent seat of the government, which would be located along the Potomac River. The act authorized the president to appoint 3 commissioners to survey and acquire property for this seat. Washington personally oversaw this effort throughout his term in office. In 1791, the commissioners named the permanent seat of government, the city of Washington in the Territory of Columbia, to honor him. Washington retired from the presidency in March 1797, attending Adams's inauguration in Congress Hall. In 1800, the Territory of Columbia became the District of Columbia when the federal government moved to the site in accordance with the provisions of the Residence Act. President Adams moved to the White House in November 1800. The Northwest Indian War. When Washington assumed the presidency, he was faced with the ongoing challenge of the Northwest Indian War. The Indian Western Lakes Confederacy had been making raids in the Northwest Territory on both sides of the Ohio River and, in the years before Washington's presidency, had grown increasingly dangerous. By the late 1780s, the United States had suffered over 1,500 casualties in ongoing hostilities. Finally, in 1790, President Washington and Secretary of War Henry Knox ordered Brigadier General Josiah Harmer to launch a major Western offensive into the Shawnee and Miami Indian Country. In October 1790, a force of 1,453 men under Brigadier General Harmer was assembled near present-day Fort Wayne, Indiana. Harmer committed only 400 of his men under Colonel John Hardin to attack an Indian force of some 1,100 warriors who easily defeated him. At least 129 soldiers were killed. Determined to avenge the defeat, Washington ordered Major General Arthur Street Clair, who was serving as the governor of the Northwest Territory, to mount a more vigorous effort by summer 1791. After considerable trouble finding men and supplies, Major General Street Clair was finally ready. At dawn on November 4, 1791, St. Clair's poorly trained force, accompanied by about 200 camp followers, was camped near the present-day location of Fort Recovery, Ohio, with poor defenses set up around their camp. An Indian force consisting of around 2,000 warriors led by Little Turtle, Blue Jacket, and Tecumseh, struck quickly and, surprising the Americans, soon overran the poorly prepared perimeter. The American casualty rate included 632 of 920 soldiers and officers killed and 264 wounded. Nearly all of the 200 camp followers were slaughtered, for a total of about 832, the highest casualty rate in any United States Indian War. After this disaster, Washington ordered the Revolutionary War veteran General Mad Anthony Wayne to launch a new expedition of well-trained troops against a coalition of tribes led by Miami Chief Little Turtle. Wayne was given command of the new Legion of the United States late in 1793. Wayne spent months training his troops to fight using forest warfare in the style of the Indians before marching boldly into the region. After entering Indian country, General Wayne constructed a chain of forts, with Fort Recovery on the site of St. Clair's defeat. In June 1794, Little Turtle again led the attack on the Americans at Fort Recovery without success, and Wayne's well-trained legion advanced deeper into the territory of the Wabash Confederacy. After Little Turtle's defeat, Blue Jacket assumed overall command of the Indian forces and engaged General Wayne and his troops in the Battle of Fallen Timbers in the summer of 1794. The Americans' force of 3,000 outnumbered the Indians 2-1. The Indians were quickly routed, and fell back. The British and Americans were reaching a close rapprochement at this time to counter Jacobin France in its French Revolution. The American troops decimated Indian villages and crops in the area, and then withdrew. Defeated, the 7 tribes, the Shawnee, Miami, Ottawa, Chippewa, Iroquois, Sauk, and Fox, ceded large portions of Indian lands to the United States and then moved west. With the American victory, major hostilities in the area came to an end. 2 treaties in 1795 sealed the new state of affairs between the Indians in the United States. The Treaty of Greenville required the tribes to cede most of Ohio and a slice of Indiana to the United States, to recognize the United States as the ruling power in the Northwest Territory, and to give 10 chiefs to the United States as hostages until all white prisoners were returned in guarantee. Jay's Treaty, which had already been signed, provided for the British withdrawal from the western forts and granted the United States supreme command of the territory.